Welcome to the first patch notes video for Open Beta and Legends of Runeterra. In this patch, we've got some card changes as well as more tweaks to the XP reward system, changes to some expedition archetypes, some UI improvements, particularly in the deck builder, and even some insight into the future schedule of the game via some developer notes. Just like last time, I will have timestamps for every card in the video description and as a pinned comment below for anyone that wants to skip to specific cards or even other sections of this video where we don't talk about the card changes. Before we get started, if you guys like this type of content, let me know by hitting the like button, as it helps support the channel and allows me to continue making this content for you guys. We've got a lot to cover, so let's jump into it. Before we jump into the cards, let's start by talking about the developer notes, and I'm not going to read through these parts of the patch notes word for word. I just want to give my thoughts about these notes, but they'll be up on your screen here. I'll be doing the same thing when we touch on other changes in these patch notes later on, such as adjustments to expedition rewards and archetypes, the UI improvements, and other changes. First off, these dev notes are great. I've said it before in previous videos, but I love the fact that Riot does these because it allows us to get into the minds of the developers a bit, which is always fun. We get to see what their intentions are, even if some of those intentions don't end up being realized. That said, there are two things in the developer notes I want to touch on, and they are the targets the dev team has set when it comes to balance changes, in particular regarding card viability, and the plans they have for a future schedule built around set releases and patches between each set once the game leaves open beta. Starting off with the goals they have when approaching balance. I love the goals they've set, but these are lofty goals, and the Runeterra team at Riot knows this. They also know that with each new set, these goals will be harder and harder to reach, because it's already difficult to hit all of these with one set of cards. As far as the targets they've set on making sure every card is a viable option in at least one deck, I think what will actually end up happening is that every card will be viable in at least one format. And what I mean by that is some cards will just end up being bad for ranked play, but they will be a viable option when drafting an expedition. That's also a tough goal to reach, but I think it's far more realistic. That said though, I think they should still push for every card to be viable in ranked play. It's a very high bar to set, but that just means that the team will make every effort to try and reach that bar, even if they don't actually get there. The possible future schedule for set releases once the game leaves open beta is the other thing I want to briefly touch on. Now, this could change, but let's assume this schedule of 3 balance patches between sets holds up after the full release of the game. Let's also say that Riot does these patches once a month. That would mean that potentially we would be getting a new set of cards every 4 months, which, while not the most amount of content among all the card games in the industry, is still a pretty good amount of new content, especially with major balance changes happening at what I assume would be around the 2-month mark between each set. Again, like the dev notes say, this could change, but if this ends up being the schedule, I'm pretty excited. I know some would want new content every 3 months, but I'm personally a fan of 4 months as a deck builder because it gives players time to solve the metagame. I'm of the belief that if you put out new sets too fast, you end up fostering a community that's lazy, and instead of trying to figure out the meta, they'll just wait on the devs to release a new set instead and not bother trying to solve the meta that they're in. And Riot could tailor balance patches in a way where they're still giving breathing room for players to solve the problems of a given metagame, so that way you can't just wait for Riot to solve everything with the next balance patch. Let's briefly tackle the next thing on the patch notes before we get into the main course, the card changes. Riot has made some small quality of life changes to the UI and wanted to let the community know that they have listened to the feedback regarding issues with the deck builder. For right now, the one quality of life improvement they've made is on the mana curve graphic when you're on the deck building screen. It will now display the number of cards your deck has at each mana cost, in addition to what your mana curve looks like. But Riot is looking at other ways to display player currency and wildcard count, redesigning how card count looks and how many cards you can see on the deck builder screen at once. As far as the UI goes, faster animations are on the menu for a future improvement, as well as more freedom to make moves that don't get blocked by animations. These are all changes I'm a fan of because while I initially said Runeterra wasn't as slow as Hearthstone in my first impressions video on the game, I do now think Runeterra is definitely on the slower side when it comes to game pace. It's not nearly as fast as other smaller games on the market, but the payoff is that it also looks much prettier than those same games do. That said, things could be sped up. It feels like Runeterra games right now play out at about the same speed as Magic Arena games do, and while it's a pace that the majority of people are used to, that's not very fast or fluid. I'll be looking forward to things speeding up in the coming months. Let's finally get into the meat of this video, the card changes. And let's start off with the champions. First off is Lux, who is now a 4-5 at level 1, which is up from a 3-4. And she's now a 5-6 at level 2, which is up from a 4-5. The buffs continue for Lux, although the last time was during the preview patch when she was reworked entirely. The rework was overall a buff though, since her play rate, while still low up until this point, did go up slightly, especially in recent weeks with players finally trying her out in Heimerdinger control shells. This is a change that I'm personally a fan of. I'm just really glad we're finally catching on to Lux being a playable option, even if it's only in one deck. Up next we have Yasuo, whose level up requirement for stunning or recalling units has been reduced from 6 to 5. This is another solid change. Similar to Lux, Yasuo has started to see a bit more play in recent weeks with varying degrees of success. Yasuo is already the type of card that you don't really want to play until you already hit Yasuo's level up requirement, so that way as soon as you play him, he levels up, similar to other cards like Ezreal. This just makes Yasuo decks get there a little bit faster, making their good matchups even stronger. I don't think this will help Yasuo's weaker matchups though, but that's not necessarily a bad thing since it's usually rare for a deck to have good matchups across the board. Moving on to the followers and spells that got changed. We're starting off with Back to Back, which has had its cost increase from 5 to 6. I'm just going to start off by saying any nerf to this card is a win in my book. I think people didn't talk enough about how powerful this card really was at 5 cost. This card was an absolute blowout and would single-handedly win games out of nowhere for elusive decks when paired with Kinkou Lifeblade in particular. And unlike Mark of the Isles, you usually got to keep at least one of your units, if not both. Never mind the other Demacia decks this card won games for. The effect is incredibly swingy, making it extremely powerful on offense and even better on defense. This has been a staple in nearly every Demacia deck up until this point, so I'm a huge fan of this change. Honestly, I want it nerfed even more than this, but a 1 mana cost increase is a start. Next we have Arena Battlecaster, whose health has been increased from 1 to 2. So I'm not sure what to think on this card. It's a buff for sure, but as a 2-1, this card was so unplayable in my opinion that I'm not even sure buffing it to a 2-2 relegates it to viable status. The attack effect on this is extremely powerful in Noxus though, so maybe this is enough for Battlecaster to see play. A 2-2 might be the best stat line for this, since if it was a 2-3, then it might be a little too good. I think discard aggro will try to mess with this card if no other deck does, but I could also see this being used in an aggressive deck that makes a lot of tokens. Maybe a Noxus Shadow Isle Spider deck is a home for this card now. Next we have Crimson Curator, whose health has been increased from 2 to 3. I really like this change too. I think this card is actually quite good in a more value-based Crimson deck featuring Vladimir. The ability to generate threats from outside of your deck can be quite powerful because it can force your opponent to spend real cards to deal with your fate cards. So you end up winning the resource battle over time. And a 3-mana 3/3 is really solid in this game. That said, I think this card seeing play will hang on Vladimir seeing play, and I am not as confident on Vladimir getting more popular. But maybe the next few changes we'll be talking about will be enough to make that happen. Up next we have Deny, who has had its cost increase from 3 to 4. This was exactly the change I was personally pushing for these past few weeks. There are definitely players that felt Deny was fine because it forced players to build better decks, and play better in games by thinking more about playing around Deny. The problem with that thinking is that it only forced non-Ionia players to play and build decks better. Not the Ionia players, who had a significantly easier time building their decks and just playing the game in general before this change. My biggest issue with Deny was that at 3 mana, it allowed Ionia unit decks, like Elusives, to just save 3 spell mana, and they could technically just spend all their normal mana on just playing units for the rest of the game, knowing they had 3 spell mana to just hold up Deny for their opponent's most impactful spell. I'm absolutely on board with this change and expect to see Ionia decks running 2 or less copies of Deny going forward, maybe even ditching it altogether. Next, we have Inspiring Mentor, which is now a 1/2, which is up from a 1/1, and grants a unit in hand +1/+0 instead of +1/+1. So this change was put in place in order to preserve the inherent weakness of elusive units, that being their lower health totals. It's a good change. Turn 1 Inspiring Mentor into turn 2 Navori Conspirator was an extremely powerful opener because the Conspirator would be a 4/3, making it not only harder to remove with a spell, but harder to trade with when using another elusive unit or a challenger unit. Other things it did were buffing Zed out of range of those same cards, as well as Fiora if you ran her. I like the change, and Elusives takes a pretty big hit with this one. This might force people back to playing Freljord if they want to continue playing Elusives, which wasn't a bad version of Elusives, but it wasn't as good as the Demacia version. Next we have Jewel Protector. This is now a 4/4, which is up from a 3/3. Interesting change. Riot stated that they wanted to shift the hand buff archetype to a later game strategy, but I feel like this change still isn't going to necessarily help that. While buffing units in hand can still be good in the late game, they seem to be best in the early game, as Elusives have proven. Regardless, +3/+3 is really strong, and Jeweled Protector now being a 4/4 means it will survive more fights to pair up with whatever unit you buffed, in addition to getting above all the popular damage base removal in the game. It'll be interesting to see if this starts popping up in ranked play, and hopefully it'll be healthy for the meta if it does. Next we have Kinkou Lifeblade. This is now a 2/2, which is down from being a 2/3. I've got quite a bit to say on this one. This is another huge nerf to Elusives. A lot of times Lifeblade was how elusive decks could outrace other aggressive decks, and usually those other aggressive decks had a pretty difficult time trading against this guy, never mind using removal on it. Now this change puts it in range of Mystic Shot, but the more important thing is that a lot more units can kill it in combat now. In particular, there are several challenger units in Demacia that can now one-shot this guy. All that said though, I was of the personal belief that Kinkou Lifeblade was actually a fairly slow card in elusive decks, and that the meta was starting to adjust to elusives in the past week or so. Piltover and Zon decks and Frostbite decks had pretty solid game against elusive decks in particular, at least in my experience. And this is going to sound like a hot take, but even fearsome decks could take games off elusive by going wide against them if their opener was good enough. Despite that, it was overall the best aggro deck you could run. A little harder to play than something like a fearsome deck, since that deck literally just plays units and nothing more. But it also had some card interactions with some of their spells that felt unfair. I'm fine with the change overall. I think this definitely marks the end of the Demacia version of Elusives for sure, which was the best version. Possibly the end of all elusive decks as we know it. I'm not throwing a party or anything though, since I didn't really care what happened to Elusives because again, I felt we were finally starting to discover decks that could beat it. Up next is Commander Ledros. This is now a 9/6 for 9 mana, which is up from an 8/6 for 8 mana, and its Blade of Ledros skill now states that its damage is rounded up. I think this change now puts Commander Ledros firmly in the camp of Shadow Isle's control decks and out of Shadow Isle's mid-range decks. Not so much because of the mana cost increase, but because those mid-range decks have now lost the ability to curve out from turn 6 onward, with another card change we'll be getting to in a second. Ledros is still a house for sure, usually being run as a one-of since you never need more than one copy once you draw him. But I think only control decks are going to be running the singleton Ledros going forward. Midrange trying to do the same thing might be a bit too greedy. I'm not a fan of Ledros' skill staying the same, that being damage from it is rounded up. I would have liked for the damage from his ability to be rounded down so it could no longer kill you at 1 health. The text change on the ability is honestly just for clarification, which was confirmed by Riot on Twitter. Up next we have Rhasa the Sunderer. This now costs 8 mana, which is up from 7 mana. Personally, I was hoping for Rhasa's ability to be changed to only hit 1 enemy on board and not 2. But Riot has decided to go with the simpler mana cost change on this one. Regardless, this change is still potentially huge because, as I was saying when we talked about Commander Ledros, this change means Shadow Isle's midrange decks no longer have the potential to curve out starting on turn 6 onward, with Hecarim being played on round 6, Rhasa on round 7 potentially, and then finally Ledros on round 8. Those decks will now need something else to do on round 7 with Rhasa going to 8 cost. Usually Hecarim is enough to win games on his own, but in case he wasn't, playing Rhasa and Ledros right behind Hecarim meant there was just no coming back for pretty much any deck. I'm still happy with this change, as I think similar to Ledros, Rhasa will see play mainly in control decks now, though unlike Ledros, I think there's a slightly higher chance that mid-range decks will still try to sneak in a few copies of Rhasa. Up next we have Scuttlegeist, and this now has Fearsome. A welcome change, though I don't think this actually changes the play rate of this card. It just means it's a bit harder to block. Riot did say they wanted to make Scuttlegeist more compelling, which this change does. I just don't think it'll be enough. But I've been wrong before. I didn't think Wraithcaller would see play when it got buffed, and look what happened there. So we'll see. Maybe Fearsome decks do actually want this card now. Next we have Tortured Prodigy. This is now a 4/4, up from being a 3/4. I like this change just because Tortured Prodigy is one of the more interesting cards in the game. It's one of the few cards that give you spell mana, and the only card that does that in Shadow Isles. I would like some weird Shadow Isles deck to show up that has synergy with killing its own units and has the spells to take advantage of the spell mana this card generates. I think it'll be hard though, because it honestly seems like you're trying to put 2 completely different strategies into one deck. I want to see someone come up with a viable deck for this card though. And finally we have Wraithcaller, which no longer has Fearsome. So we've gone from this card getting a health buff and gaining Fearsome, only to have its Fearsome taken away. I can't help but think the Balance team felt like they overbuffed this card last patch. Like I said earlier, I turned out to be dead wrong when I said Wraithcaller wouldn't see any play, as Fearsome midrange has been one of the best decks in the game up until this point. Although the slower versions running Rhasa and Ledros have now taken a hit, and this is another hit. Fearsome midrange had arguably the best turn 4 play in the game when this card puts a minimum of 6 power in play and both units were tough to block with the Fearsome tag. Now at least Wraithcaller can be chump blocked, but I still think it'll see play in Fearsome midrange. I would argue this change is actually less impactful for that deck than the Ledros and Rhasa changes we talked about. Because of those nerfs, the deck itself may have to adapt by lowering its mana curve or risk getting pushed out of the meta. Let's talk about what's on the watch list, and this time around, it's not specific cards they're keeping an eye on, but the Fearsome mechanic itself and control decks as a whole. Again, I won't be reading this, and I think the changes in this patch are enough to keep Fearsome decks in check. But I do want to say that I think it's interesting that Riot wants to keep an eye on control when it has yet to dominate any meta. They did acknowledge this, but that leads me to believe Riot does not want control decks to be too powerful in this game, or maybe not even the best deck in any meta. And I personally think this is a good thing, not because I hate control as an archetype. I think it should be good. But if this game is going to appeal to mobile players who just want to play a quick game or two here and there, you can't have your average game time be too long. Otherwise, the general player base won't find it fun. And control decks promote long game times. On the flip side, I don't think it can be too short either, because that also isn't deemed fun, despite fun being subjective. Hyper-aggressive aggro decks promote super short game times, so it's a delicate balance from a design perspective, and being on mobile plays a part in that. One other quick change Riot made is on the clarity of units with skills that allow opponents to react to the effects those skills have, by giving those units a skill icon. This is only good for the game since it's easier for players to understand icons rather than just text on a card, and gives those cards more identity. Moving on to Expedition changes, starting with surprisingly some of the archetypes of Expedition. And these I'll read off since they are specifically about card swaps. There are changes to 4 of the archetypes, Battle Scars and Shroom and Boom, which receive some buffs in their card packs, and Demacian Steel and Suit Up, which receive some nerfs to their card packs. Demacian Steel has Chain Vest added to their card lineup, which will make certain Demacian Steel picks a little weaker. Suit Up has had Alpha Wildclaw removed in exchange for Bull Elnuck, making it a bit weaker. In contrast, Battle Scars now has Alpha Wildclaw in exchange for removing Bull Elnuck, so we've got a bit of a trade there. Finally, the Shroom and Boom packs have had Assembly Bot, Plaza Guardian, and Static Shock added to their packs, and Chempunk Shredder, Academy Prodigy, and Get Excited have been removed. Also, there have been minor improvements to the shopkeeper logic while making trades in Expedition, so trades should just be more compelling overall. I don't play Expedition much, so I don't have much to say on these changes, just that it's cool that this is how Riot is approaching balance changes to this format. It feels pretty unique actually. Moving on to changes to the XP reward system regarding Ranked and Expedition. I won't go through these in detail, but basically some of the XP rewards have been shifted from Expedition over to Ranked. Riot stated that in the old system, Expedition was just the optimal way to grind for XP, and I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, and this was my one issue with the system, this kind of forced players to play Expedition if they wanted the maximum XP rewards, which prompted these shifts. The one big gain from this is that now you will continue to gain XP for an unlimited amount of games per day, which will reward the grinders since previously the XP rewards were capped at 30 games. One other change that I'm sure some are going to be disappointed in is the reduction of XP rewards when playing friends. This is Riot basically acknowledging that the previous system was getting abused through friend challenges, since people would snap concede over and over to get enormous amount of XP per day. Finally, some shard rewards were shifted away from 7-win Expedition runs over to 6-win Expedition runs, which is a welcome change because you still will earn enough shards to do another Expedition run if you hit 7 wins, while the 6-win runs don't feel so bad as far as shards earned. This next and final change is something I've heard a lot of complaints about, surprisingly, but Riot has finally added FPS options to the game. Previously, the game was basically locked at 30 FPS outside of interactive moments, and some couldn't help but think it was for mobile reasons, but that's not a reason to limit options on PC, especially since the game, while designed with mobile in mind, isn't on mobile yet. Anyway, now you'll be able to go up to 60 FPS. This is something I can't wait to try personally, and I'm glad these options are finally in. The remaining improvements are just miscellaneous ones as well as bug fixes. Some things I mentioned earlier, like the mana curve graphic indicating number of cards you have at each cost, and others like board visual improvements. But there's one thing I absolutely must mention. The Anivia deck summoning bug has been fixed. I repeat, the Anivia deck summoning bug has been fixed. Now I can finally play Thresh and Anivia in the same deck. And we are finally done. If you guys made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for the support. Again, if you enjoyed this format or just the video in general, let me know by hitting the like button below and leaving a comment. I appreciate constructive criticism and feedback since I'm always looking to do things better. There's more videos on the way, so if you don't want to miss out, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the notification bell below to guarantee that you get my videos in your sub box. Also, feel free to check out all the other social media places I hang out at. I do also stream Legends of Runeterra live on Twitch if that's something you like to watch. Links to everything are in the video description below. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.